Did you come alone? You're not wearing a wire? Okay, if you're a cop, you got to tell me. Okay. Do you want to buy some RAM? Come on, come on. I got DDR4, DDR5. I've got UDIM, I've got RDIM, I've got ECC. Come on, you naughty devil. I could make those programs run so good. Look, I know it's not going to be a big surprise to a number of you in the loop that RAM prices are currently insane right now, but a number of you that are migrating away from cloud services onto your own private data ownership system, and you were looking at turnkey or DIY, are suddenly finding out for the first time that this little necessary but common component is suddenly going through the roof price-wise. This is the Johnspo N6. I had to build this for a video. I was trying to choose between either having 64 gig of memory or buying an apartment in the Burj Khalifa. This is insane what's happening right now. And this video today is about those of you buying your first NAS, DIY or turnkey, that are thinking of having their NAS for a very specific purpose. This is about helping you understand how much memory you need for now. Today I'm going to go through different user case scenarios and the recommended memory. I would say this is not the maximum. I would say this is what you should buy now, but with a scale up. If you've got multiple SODIMMs, even better. This is about having the right amount of memory out the gate. So let's crack on with our first example. First up, standard file access. A number of you are just using a NAS for backups, just Time Machine, streaming the odd bit of media on DLNA. Nothing, particularly egregious, and also a little bit of remote, but predominantly local. For these setups, I would go no less than 4 gigabytes of memory. Now, a number of you are immediately going to say, well, there's loads of solutions out there that rock out the gate with 2 gig, and, more fair to them. But I'll say right now, the way modern applications, and particularly NAS operating systems, have evolved in the last few years to be a lot more, let's say, hungry for holding on to the memory until they're either told or forced to flush it, the result is that 2 gig of memory will end up being utilized more than 50% by the operating system itself when it's doing those basic mainline native processes. That's why 4 gig should be your entry point then. It's why 4 gig, you may have noticed over the last few years, has become the minimum, not just because of rising RAM prices with cryptocurrency and now AI, but just 4 gig allows for 1 to 2 gig for the operating system and services to do their job, and the other 2 gig to actually handle the file transmission. Multimedia, or more precisely things like Plex and Jellyfin, I would immediately say out of the gate, I would not go less than 4 gig once again if you're going to be going up to 4K media. Realistically, I would of course recommend higher than that, but this video is about recommending the default amount you need. It's not that Plex or Jellyfin is particularly egregious in terms of what they use. They generally occupy any given time around 300 to 500 megs when you're doing the odd process generally and just streaming. But when it comes to metadata scraping, when it comes to reassessing and rescanning those databases there, when it comes to larger files being accessed, you will find when you go into the dashboard or something like Plex, that when you see the resource utilization, you can see that that baseline OS has already taken a chunk there at the beginning, and then Plex or Jellyfin will end up living somewhere around 300 to 500 megs base. And that means the minute you're using certain file conversion methodologies for audio or video, that memory utilization will also go up. Nowhere near in the same spike as you find with a CPU, but still, memory utilization with more aggressive file types is a thing. And therefore, again, baseline 4 gig. And I know some of these operating systems, if you go to these applications for multimedia streaming, you can go and find their recommended minimum specs. And a lot of them actually go as low as 1 gigabyte, ignore it. 4 gig, definitely. If you're going to go higher than 4K, very few are, but if you're going to go higher than 4K, that's when I'll start looking at 8K multimedia. Because although some of the overhead, it can be pushed to client devices, generally you find it's all been done for the most part on the host, and the host needs those resources. And by the way, much like a lot of the other examples I'm going to talk about today, a number of you use NASes for multiple purposes. So in that case, always reserve at least 2 gig for the system operating system, and then everything else on top after that. Surveillance is the first of our how long is a piece of string case examples, because realistically, surveillance to me and surveillance to you can mean very different things. It could be that you're running 2 to 3 to 4 cameras using the small number of camera licenses your brand has given you, and therefore you're not really going to exceed that. Or you might be going for a full corporate environment with cameras inside and out, and let's get onto the subject of AI later on. In that scenario, I would reserve around 1 gigabyte for every 4 cameras. Now that does seem a lot because you can get away with much less than that. But I would always reserve around 256 megabytes per camera, because when something happens and that camera starts recording, because remember you might have it so it's alert based, all of a sudden that camera is going to be higher saturating the connection that it has with the switch, and more precisely the NAS that all the data is being sent to. It's by no means an oversaturation, but in a case scenario where you have got multiple cameras and you are tracking an intruder, tracking an incident as it has occurred, chances are that you're going to need those cameras to all of a sudden all be sharing out the system resources. So you might see that your 4, 6, 8 cameras aren't actually using that much RAM. That's because they're not in high fidelity recording, get that sent to the system. Indeed, a lot of the time, these cameras, when they are on 24/7 record 1 minute before, 1 minute after, they're actually using a lower bit rate. And then after that, because they're constantly flashing it, you may find that the camera software that you're utilizing will suddenly ramp up RAM and storage utilization in those those trigger moments. But that brings us to AI cameras, because a number of you have factored in AI cameras into your own network video recording environment, with or without a NAS. Now, a lot of that comes down to edge. Some cameras have got edge AI. That means they're doing a lot of those processes externally. For those, you're not going to have to worry too much about increasing the RAM on your base system. But having cameras with edge AI is one thing. A number of you might use a system like the DVAs from Synology, some of QNAP's own system where you use some of those applications and services in Surveillance Center, which have got AI components built in, which then track the existing feed coming in. For those, AI utilization, again, will ramp up, and I would definitely recommend 256 meg per camera. Again, once you reach 12 to 16 cameras, that's when you have to start looking at further assistance, further edge, or even factoring in a secondary NVR, again, depending on the scale of the cameras, AI integration, and the fluidity of those feeds. Containers, or for most users just Docker utilization, is another one of those you get out what you put in scenarios, and the extent to which you're going to be using containerized applications is going to reflect how much memory you need. I'm going to say it out the gate, 8 gig minimum. You of course can use a lot of NASs with less than 8 gig, and a number of NAS brands, be they DIY or turnkey NAS, actually allow you to use containerization with as little as 2 to 4 gigabytes. But again, this comes down to the system resources underneath. Remember earlier when I mentioned Plex and the OS? Well, with containerization, you have the bare metal, the CPU, the memory, the system hardware. Then you have the operating system there on top. Then you have the containerized application, which, by the way, still uses system resources even with no containers installed there. And then finally, you've got your container or containers. Now, remember, the container application in most cases will hold on to the memory, it will hoard it. When you do a system reboot, it'll obviously flush a great deal of it, but the RAM utilization in the area, the capacity of the RAM that's being utilized by your containers isn't immediately flush. And it's another example of the more intelligent or the more versatile NAS operating systems quickly kicking away and removing some of the held memory. Nonetheless, if you are going to run containerized applications, the reason I say 8 gig minimum isn't just because of the layers, but also because it gives you room to graduate. If you're going to have smart home, if you're going to be taking advantage, again, of multimedia, if you're going to be taking advantage of bridging mechanics and other apps and services that are not native to your NAS, giving it that extra bit of RAM, giving instead of 2, 4 gig may be beneficial to you. There is memory sharing, of course, but still nonetheless, when it comes to containerization, 8 gig minimum, ideally more, but if you are pushed for price, 8 gig out the gate and upgrade later. But this gets doubled when we talk about virtual machines and VMs. These effectively are whole system operating system environments running on a pre-existing operating system environment there. Again, you've got your bare metal, you've got your NAS operating system, you've got your VM hypervisor, and then you've got your VM or VMs. For this utilization, I would never go less than 16 gig of memory. The reason being that once you do deploy a VM, it's actually a lot easier to overspend the amount of RAM and then start erring backwards rather than assigning, say, 2 or 4 gig and then erring up for performance sake. Remember, you're going to be accessing these VMs remotely, and in that, or remotely on the LAN, or remotely over the network, or over the internet. However, the amount of RAM occupied by the virtual machine and by the hypervisor itself is actually higher in a lot of cases, or in most cases realistically, than that of containerization and things like Docker. More so though, when you are running multiple VMs at any given time, you can enable some features such as memory swapping, or when you are running VM, there's actually shared memory pools, but these shouldn't be relied upon. They're nice efficiency measures, but I wouldn't rely on them unless you are running particularly high-end systems where the CPU is doing a much better job of managing those resources. And unfortunately, most NAS systems sub $2,000 don't really come with the right CPUs that do a great job of, spinning all of those plates at once in terms of virtualization. They do the job, but memory swapping and memory sharing, not so much. And that's notwithstanding that the NAS you're going to be utilizing will almost certainly be taking advantage of things like snapshots, taking advantage of backing up, and in some cases going to be cloning existing VMs for experimentation or testing. The actual virtual machine operating systems that you're deploying, again, Ubuntu, Windows, any kind of Linux-based one really, any of these that you're going to deploy, yes, their pre-existing recommended levels of hardware is important, but still, I would not go less for any system that's going to be running VMs, nothing less than 16 gig. And again, someone's going to say in the comments 16 gig isn't much, and you're right, but this is about recommended minimums while things are sort of insane price-wise. And finally, ZFS or ZFS. I remember a time when if you wanted ZFS, you had to go to TrueNAS, but now you can actually get support or full file system native deployment in ZFS from a number of different brands. And that does bring into question, if you're going to run like a QNAP or your own DIY TrueNAS server, what's the recommended minimum? I would not go any less than 16 gig. And by the way, when I say 16, I mean 32 really, but we are talking about what we can afford. 16 gig, I would not go any less. Now, again, we have to factor in the system's systems operating system utilization. But the main reason is that there are some bells and whistles built into ZFS, particularly inline deduplication, but inline compression, inline compaction, all of these features and facilities that are done on the fly, that if you have less than 16 gig, you are going to have a bad time. Now, there are NASs out there that run with 12 gig, it can be done in some cases, but because 12 gig is such a weird number in most cases, because you're not going to have a SIC26 modules, you're either going to have pre-soldered 12 gig of RAM modules directly onto the board, or you're going to be using mixed SODIMMs. It is recommended to go for 16 when it comes to ZFS or ZFS NAS deployment there. But there you go, those are the recommended RAM quantities that I would say to anyone buying a new NAS or building a new NAS going into 2026. The pricing around RAM right now is sort of bonkers. I don't think it's going to get much cheaper too soon. If that AI bubble does burst, that'll be a slightly different situation. But I will say right now that buying RAM, there's often some good deals that can be found on the likes of eBay for buying second-hand servers. Just for the RAM, it sounds insane, but do keep in mind you have to double check not only that you're supporting SODIMM over something like UDIMM or RDIMM, but also the speed of memory, and the connection between something like DDR4 and DDR5 are different. You can't just go for a different quantity or indeed a different architecture of RAM. Stay within your DDR lane. But thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.